I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're gathered on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. And so thank you very much for having me here. It's a huge privilege. This year, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is celebrating such a massive achievement, 100 years of alleviating human suffering and preventing it wherever it may be in the world. And I also thank you for inviting me here to speak today, because I truly believe that the topic I've been invited to speak on, climate change, is one that will define the life of my generation, my children's generation, and all generations to follow, and will also really dramatically shape the work of humanitarian organisations like the Red Cross. So I'm here as the co-director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. This photo shows just a few of our 100,000 members around the country, and we're now one of the largest youth-run organisations in Australia, and we're growing really rapidly. And we represent a really diverse grassroots movement. We have young people who are high school students who are fundraising to get their principal to put solar panels on the roof of their gym. We represent young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth who are witnessing the impact that climate change is having on their lands right now. We represent university students who are leading massive national campaigns that are holding our government and the biggest companies in the world to account. And so I want to start by telling you a little bit about my journey to get involved in the AYCC, and also to share some lessons that we can draw from my story and the stories that have led more than 100,000 young Australians to get involved. So I first became involved when I was a university student back in 2009. Before that, I want to talk a little bit about the way that I grew up and some of the things that influenced me. So I grew up in a really beautiful area of the world called Cottesbridge. For those of you who don't know it, it's about an hour's drive northeast of the city of Melbourne. I grew up on a 20-acre bush block with my parents and older sister. It was a really beautiful place to grow up in this tiny 100-year-old cottage. And the one thing was the summers, as they are in many places in the country, were very harsh, very dry, a lot of droughts, and there were many summers where we would spend them watching the dam dry up. My parents would have to buy water for our animals and get it shipped in, and they would be on constant bushfire alert. However, I didn't really connect the dots at that stage, and I thought that this was nothing out of the ordinary. This is Australia. We live in a harsh but beautiful country. And so at school, I was really very passionate about human rights and humanitarian issues. And, I'm really excited to be here today because actually when I was at school, I dreamt of one day being involved and working for organisations like the Red Cross, who are working to alleviate human suffering. And I learnt about climate change in the abstract when I was at school, but honestly, it just seemed like it wasn't that urgent and it wasn't the most important use of my time when there are human beings who are suffering all over the world right now who need our help and our protection. However, I did eventually connect the dots, and that happened in 2009, at the start of that year when the Black Saturday bushfires tore through regional Victoria and came within 6 kilometres of my family home in Cottesbridge. And over 170 people were killed as part of those fires, including my high school English teacher, friends of my parents, and it was the first time that I really saw, what a disaster meant. It was truly a disaster. The word disaster attached to natural suddenly meant something to me. And it was truly terrifying to think that this phrase that I'd heard about, more frequent and extreme weather events, what that actually meant for communities on the ground. And I know that the Red Cross was a huge part of the response and recovery to that, and that is actually still going to this day. And so I want to say a huge thank you to anyone in the room who's been a part of that and for the whole movement for making it possible. And so what this experience meant for me from then on, though, was that when I was reading news reports about climate change, or when I was at university studying environmental politics, when I heard about the risk of more frequent and severe extreme weather events, it really hit home, and I had a reference point for what that actually meant. And so that led me to start to seek out more information. And after I'd sought out more information, I thought, I really need to do something about this, and I started to look for ways to get involved. And so this was my entry point into activism. And although the specifics of my situation are quite different to other people who may have gotten involved in the AYCC, I think there are a couple of lessons that can be drawn and that we've learned over the years. And the first one is that education alone is actually quite disempowering, even education about the solutions. So receiving information about climate change and what is happening is incredibly disheartening and overwhelming for young people, and that was the experience that I had. And the second lesson, I think, is that you need to give people the opportunity to take action that's actually in line with the scale of the challenge that they are facing and with what they're willing to do. So because I was a young person, when I signed up to volunteer with large organisations, because I didn't have any real skills or experience, as an entry-level point, they'd give me tasks like, stuffing envelopes, or if I was lucky, writing a blog for the website. I actually also found this incredibly disempowering. And so when I found the AYCC, it was so exciting because here was a group of young people who were supporting other young people to do whatever it would take. And if you were willing to devote your life to this, you would be supported to do that. And there was no limit to the action that I could take. And so I think that's the second lesson that we can draw from people's entry point into this kind of work. And so I just want to backtrack a bit because I've said that I think climate change and what we do about it in the next decade is going to really dramatically shape the world we live in for the next century. And so I want to take a few minutes to just talk about why I believe that is. And I know that there are many people in this room who are experts on this matter and know more about it than I do, so I apologise for that and bear with me, but I do think it's really important to be grounded in the reality of the situation that we're facing. And so to kind of summarise what I'm about to say in the rest of my speech, what I've learnt about climate change in the last 5 years is truly more frightening than anything I ever could have imagined when I first got involved. However, at the same time, what I've learnt about the movement of people who are standing up and doing something about it is more inspiring, gives me more hope than anything I dreamed to imagine back then either. So this is the story that I want to tell today. So let's start with the problem and what's at stake. So what I'm going to do now is show a quick video which shows average temperature on the Earth over the last, since 1884, in fact. So as you can see, since the Industrial Revolution, we've actually already warmed the Earth, on average, almost an entire degree. And in fact, I personally have never experienced a single month of below average global temperature, and neither has anyone in the world who is under the age of 28. So that's the magnitude of what we've already done. But this is actually just a fraction of the warming that may happen if we don't take action in the next critical decade. So this is an image which is showing two very different worlds that could exist at the end of the century. So the image on the left is the world in the year 2100, as it could look if we take really aggressive action on climate change. And what you can see about that world is that average temperature is still between 1 degree and 2 degrees warmer than it is today. So that's basically what we've locked in, but if we take really aggressive steps in the next decade, we can limit warming to below 2 degrees, which is internationally what's been agreed as the safe limit by most governments. And what I'll just say about why that's agreed to as a safe limit is that because after you warm the Earth more than that amount, you start to set off tipping points in nature, natural feedback loops that make things happen much more rapidly and are much less within our control. So for example, there's a huge amount of permafrost that is melting in Siberia. Once that melts, there's a huge amount of methane gas that then gets released from underneath, and that's a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, so that speeds up the warming, melts more permafrost, more methane is released, and so on and so forth, and there's not a huge amount we can do about it. So that leads me to the world that's on the right. And the world on the right, as you can see, is about 4 to 6 degrees warmer than any world that has ever sustained human life on Earth. So this is really something that we don't know what this will look like if it happens. And the other thing that I want to draw your attention to, so on the slide it says continued inaction, but actually what this is our current trajectory. So adding up all the action that's currently being planned around the world, so even with all of that, this is the world that we're currently on track for. And so what does this actually mean for what life will be like? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just recently in the last couple of weeks released their latest report. And the IPCC gives us a very good picture of what is happening and what is likely to happen, because essentially what they do is they look over and synthesize thousands of peer-reviewed published articles to come up with a picture of what's happening. One thing I would say is some people say they're actually quite conservative. They're looking at likely scenarios, not the worst case scenario, and when something has potentially catastrophic consequences like climate change, potentially you should actually look to the worst case scenario outcomes. However, the IPCC does give us a good picture of what's likely to occur with 4 degrees of warming or more, and the impacts would be devastating. So I'm just going to read out some of the things that they predict. So 95% of the world's oceans will experience significant sea level rise. Staple foods like wheat, rice and corn will be affected, leading to food insecurity. Extreme weather, as we know, will be more frequent and severe. Water shortages will be widespread. Economic growth will slow. And as a result of all this, poverty alleviation will be much, much more difficult to achieve. And to make it even more tangible, the Climate Institute in Australia has talked about what this might mean for Australia. And so for a young person born today, if they see 4 to 6 degrees of warming, in their lifetime they could witness up to 10,000 more heat-related deaths annually, up to a 90% decline in irrigated agriculture, widespread species loss, including the extinction of most butterflies, complete destruction of the Great Barrier Reef, hundreds of billions of dollars in damages to building and transport infrastructure due to sea level rise, and as we know, many more frequent and severe bushfires and floods. So I think the point I want to underline is this is absolutely a fight for survival. And I think nowhere illustrates that better than the fight that's currently going on in the Pacific. And so I want to take a few minutes now to show you, it's a little bit of a long video, but I think it's really worth watching it in full. This is a video of someone called Kathy, a woman from the Marshall Islands, who spoke at the recent United Nations Emergency Summit on Climate Change, which was back in September of this year.
Our next speaker was selected from more than 500 candidates to represent the voice of civil society. From the Marshall Islands, please welcome Kathy Jetnil Kijner.
Yahweh Molib. My family and I have traveled a long way to be here today, all the way from the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands encompasses more than 2 million square kilometers of ocean, and so it makes sense that our culture is one of voyaging and navigation. One of our most beloved legends features a canoe race between 10 brothers. Their mother, holding a heavy bundle, begged each of her sons for a ride on their canoe. But only the youngest listened and took her along for the ride, not knowing that his mother was carrying the first sail. With the sail, he won the race and became chief. The moral of the story is to honor your mother and the challenges life brings. Climate change is a challenge that few want to take on, but the price of inaction is so high. Those of us from Oceania are already experiencing it firsthand. We've seen waves crashing into our homes and our breadfruit trees wither from the salt and drought. We look at our children and wonder how they will know themselves or their culture should we lose our islands. Climate change affects not only us islanders, it threatens the entire world. To tackle it, we need a radical change of course. This isn't easy, I know. It means ending carbon pollution within my lifetime. It means supporting those of us most affected to prepare for unavoidable climate impacts. And it means taking responsibility for irreversible loss and damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions. The people who support this movement are Indigenous mothers like me, families like mine, and millions more, standing up for the changes needed and working to make them happen. I ask world leaders to take us all along on your ride. We won't slow you down. We'll help you win the most important race of all, the race to save humanity. I would now like to share with you a poem that I have written for my daughter, Matefele Benham. Dear Matefele Benham, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. You are thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Matefele Benham, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lazy lounging lagoon, lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander, rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Matefele Benham, don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas. No backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals. No blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's becoming a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here because we, baby, are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, boo-boo, Jima, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, who like to pretend that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, floods of Algeria, Colombia, Pakistan, and all the hurricanes, earthquakes, and tidal waves didn't exist? Still, there are those who see us, hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coast ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the fresh, clean soil of the farmers past. We are teenagers, blooming petitions. We are families, biking, recycling, reusing, engineers, building, dreaming, designing, artists, painting, dancing, writing, and we are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the streets, marching hand in hand, chanting for change now. And they're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Matefele Benham, you are eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes and sleep in peace because we won't let you down. You'll see.
Right, so what a brilliant speech that so perfectly illustrates what's at stake. And what our choice is in the next decade, our choice is whether we change the current trajectory that the world is on and we prevent our grandchildren experiencing a world that is so unlike the world that humanity has ever thrived on. As she says, it's not just about wanting to survive, it's about wanting to thrive. And I really believe that in order to do this, the most important thing we can do is to stand in solidarity with people like Kathy and with the most vulnerable people on earth who have the most at stake. And that's why I'm really proud to work with young people, because young people in future generations have a special stake in this issue as the ones who inherit the consequences of choices that we make. And also we need to stand with more vulnerable places in the world than Australia. In Australia, in fact, we have a very special responsibility because we are one of the highest per capita emitters of pollution in the world, carbon pollution, and we also are one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels. We're the second biggest exporter of coal in the world and on track to become the largest exporter of gas by the year 2020. And so with this in mind, a few weeks ago I was in Newcastle and I was there joining 30 people from the Pacific Island nations, from 12 Pacific Island nations, that's some of them pictured there, and they have kickstarted a movement they called the Pacific Warriors, and their aim really is to send a message to the world, which is we are not just going to stand by and drown, we are going to fight. We are warriors. Being warriors is part of our culture, and we're now bringing that spirit to the climate fight. And so as an Australian, I chose to be there with them in Newcastle as they took on a symbolic action, which was to take traditional canoes they'd carved back in their communities and take them out into the water and attempt to symbolically block coal ships who were leaving Newcastle, the world's biggest coal port. And when I was there was a speech from a friend of mine, a young Samoan woman who now lives in Sydney, and I want to read out what she said in her speech. She said, "The Pacific Islands think of Australia as our big brother and us as the little brothers. Well, I'm here to say, big brothers do not let their little brothers drown. Australia's business model is drowning the Pacific." And so I think that kind of sums up what's at stake globally, but also what our responsibility is here in Australia to our little brothers and little sisters all over the world and to young and future generations. So I want to talk now about what I believe the solution is, because there is a whole other side of this story which is about good news. The good news is that we actually have everything that we need on a technical level to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, while still maintaining quality of life in developed countries and achieving sustainable development in developing countries. We have energy efficiency technology, we have renewable power that studies repeatedly show can provide all the energy needs that we have sustainable agriculture solutions, and these are being rolled out all across the world. So this sustainable revolution is happening. Our job isn't to usher it in. Our job is, though, to put our foot on the accelerator. And the reason that's so important is because increasingly scientists are talking about this next decade as the critical decade. And the reason this is the critical decade is because we know that what we're talking about is a really fundamental shift in our energy systems, in the way that we do business, in the laws that govern us. And you just can't achieve that incredibly rapidly. So we have to act in the next decade, because that's how we can make sure that this transition actually protects the people who are most vulnerable on Earth, rather than heading towards economic and environmental collapse, which would happen if we tried to do it incredibly rapidly after that. And so we really need to usher in this transition in the next critical decade. And so that's why people talk about, although the ramifications of our actions will be felt for the next 100 years, it's actually in the next few years that we need to peak emissions. I actually think critical decade makes it seem like a greater window than we actually have. Most people say ideally we could peak global emissions by 2020, which is just 5 years away. And so what can we do in the next 10 years to ensure that we leave our children and our grandchildren a safe climate? So I really think that the answer lies in what was happening outside that room where Kathy spoke, and which she referenced briefly in her speech. So this is a photo of the largest mobilisation that has ever happened in the world on climate change. This is a photo in the streets of New York, where a couple of days before the Emergency Climate Summit in September, more than 300,000 people took to the streets and marched and demanded action on climate change. And the really special thing about it was that it was led by young people and by Indigenous people, who we know have the most to lose from this issue. And that wasn't the end of the story. There were 2,000 other events around the world in solidarity in 160 different nations, including many in Australia. You may remember the one in Melbourne had over 30,000 people, and so it was a truly enormous day of action on climate change. So that's kind of, let's go back for a sec, that's kind of the bird's eye view, the macro level of a movement that I truly think will change the course of history and will become strong enough in the critical decade to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The caveat is it only will if everybody unites and joins this movement and calls for the action that's needed. So I want to turn now from this macro view to the micro view by telling a story of a campaign that has been run by AICC volunteers and also by a local community in Port Augusta. So Port Augusta is a small town. It's about 300 kilometres outside of Adelaide, and for years it has been essentially all the jobs and the economy has been based on these two really dirty and now outdated coal-fired power stations. And they're just a kilometre from the town. On some days the wind changes direction and all the coal dust gets blown over the community, and they have very high rates of cancer and respiratory diseases. And then it was announced that the coal-fired power stations were actually going to be closed, and so there would even be higher unemployment and more social issues in this region associated with that. So Port Augusta really didn't have good prospects at that time, and what made matters worse was the federal government and the state government were proposing to replace the coal-fired power stations with gas. And gas has many environmental problems associated with it and also doesn't provide many jobs for the local community. And this was kind of their one shot to get the local economy growing again. And so we decided to team up with a research organisation called Beyond Zero Emissions and with a group of locals in Port Augusta. And we decided to look at, are there any different solutions? You know, Port Augusta is very hot and very sunny. Maybe there's a renewable energy project that could work. And it turns out that Port Augusta is actually the best location in Australia to build what's called a solar thermal plant. And this is a really large-scale, exciting renewable energy project that essentially stores the energy from the sun in these giant towers and then can provide baseload power. And it's the kind of thing that we really need to start being built here in Australia. It's already being built in a really massive scale in places like California and Spain. And just turns out that Port Augusta is one of the best places to build those in Australia. And so the problem was that the local community wanted these things to be built, but the government wasn't listening. And so we decided to demonstrate just how high the support was for solar thermal instead of gas by organising a community vote. So there are the results of the vote, which we put up at the local football ground. So 99% of the community said that they wanted to go for solar thermal over gas. And my favourite part of this story is that a third of the local community turned out to vote, which is higher than the previous local council elections. So it was a really top priority. However, that wasn't enough to convince the federal government, who are more swayed by what's on the national agenda than what's happening in a regional town. And so the AICC thought, well, this is our challenge, we're going to get this on the national agenda. So what we decided to do was we would walk the results of this vote, the 328 kilometres from Port Augusta to Adelaide, and we'd meet with people all along the way. And we were met when we arrived in Adelaide with a 2,000-person rally. And so I'm going to show a video just showing what we achieved.
2005 come on the walk because it was just unlike any campaign I've ever been a part of before, unlike anything that I've ever heard of.
When I heard that, there's this community right near us that really needs our support, all I wanted to do was get on board with this campaign.
Port Augusta's coal-powered plants have run out of puff.
They're the oldest and dirtiest power stations in the country.
This is the dirtiest power station in the country.
And now the community has a choice.
To replace that state's ageing brown coal-fired power stations with solar thermal energy.
We've got a sun there up in the sky, so why not use it?
99% of the Port Augusta community voted in favour of solar.
We want the jobs. We don't want our young ones to have to leave town to get jobs.
This community has suffered. We need to change now.
But the state government still needs to be persuaded, and that was the intention of a 14-day walk which wound up over the weekend.
Dozens of activists have walked more than 300 kilometres through the South Australian outback, all in the name of solar.
Over their 2-week journey, they've had to contend with hail, up to 110km/h winds, and some sweltering days over 30 degrees.
Lack of showers.
Sleeping
has been a bit of a challenge.
Well, it sounds like a bit of people power. Everyone involved might have made a big difference. Many thanks for joining us this morning.
After 2 weeks on foot, the solar supporters reached their destination, still walking on sunshine.
The activists from across Australia were met by 1,000 well-wishers in Adelaide.
The Energy Minister was very pro the gas option, but after seeing how much community support there was, he is singing the praises of solar.
Quite an outcome.
There's cheaper electricity for Australians and no emissions. What's not to like?
And this is an incredible opportunity to build the first big solar thermal plant in Australia.
It's time that the state and federal government step up and start funding solutions, not more pollution.
Someone's got to do it, and we're going to do it now.
Great. So that was what a group of 100 young people from around the country managed to achieve just by saying we're willing to do what it takes to stand in solidarity with the people of Port Augusta and say, no, your issue does deserve to be on the national stage. And as a result of the Walk for Solar, we had the Energy Minister come out in support of the project. We were invited to Canberra to meet with key decision makers. And since then, if you fast forward a couple of years, we have held community forums. We have talked to thousands of voters in the lead up to the federal election last year in Adelaide, and actually the support has grown so strong in Port Augusta itself that before the federal election last year, every single candidate across the political spectrum, from Family First to the Greens to the major parties, all said that this was their top priority and the number one issue facing their electorate. So that just shows how it is possible to rise above petty politics when you work with the local community and you actually build real power at a grassroots level. And this year, we managed to actually achieve a $3 million feasibility study into solar thermal for Port Augusta, which is being funded partly by the government, but also by the coal company that owns the power stations. And that just shows how many people we have convinced that this is the right thing for Port Augusta. And so the reason I wanted to tell this small story in some ways of what can be achieved is so that when we return to this photo and think of the hundreds of thousands of people in New York and around the world who stood up on that day and took action, that actually those aren't just people who took to the streets on one day, but imagine how many stories like Port Augusta is represented on that street. And I think that that's what really gives me hope and gives me inspiration. And so I want to share one of my favourite quotes of all time about climate change. When asked if I'm pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science and about what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, you don't understand the data. But if you meet the people who are working to restore this Earth and the lives of the poor, and you aren't optimistic, you haven't got a pulse. And so I want to thank the Red Cross for its incredibly valuable work on climate change, particularly adaptation, preparedness, response and recovery. The climate has changed and we will continue to see the impacts of these changes for the next 100 years, no matter what we do now. And humanitarian organisations like the Red Cross have a really critical role to play in ensuring that communities are resilient. But at the AOSCC we talk about two things. We talk about resistance and resilience, and we think that the best way to build resilience in a community is to give them the tools to actually resist the injustices that have caused this problem in the first place. And so in the next 2 days, I guess I particularly ask you to think about the role that the Red Cross will play in the next critical decade for action. We know that the best cure is prevention, and if the response to more frequent and extreme weather events, if the recovery phase, if that can rise above petty politics, then surely so can the prevention of these crises. Another of my favourite quotes from Bill McKibben is, "You can't negotiate with physics." And when we say that climate change is a political issue and demanding that fossil fuel companies are accountable and that governments reduce our pollution is a political issue, we're essentially saying that you can negotiate with physics, which we can't. People are entitled to their own political opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And the fear of people from my generation, I think, is that if the world doesn't act in the next critical decade, we're going to see upwards of 4 or even 6 degrees of warming, and that this is going to lead to a world that is so chaotic that actually there's no humanitarian response that will be able to deal with it. However, my real hope is that this issue will continue to unite people across the political spectrum, people who are from unions and from faith organisations and Indigenous communities, and we will unite, we will stand behind the people who have the most at stake in this issue, and we will create a call to world leaders that is so strong and powerful they have no choice but to do the right thing. And so I just want to finish with one last quote, which is the title of a book that's recently been published by Naomi Klein. I think it just sums up everything, and that is, "To change everything, we need everyone." Thank you.